I'll start out by telling you a bit about my story. Some of you are more familiar with me than others. My father was raised in a traditional Jewish family. During World War II, they were sending the Jews to the concentration camps. His family escaped, went to the coast of Africa, from Europe, and then to the United States. He was going to synagogue. At one point, someone put a copy of the New Testament in his hands. Since his last name was Levi, he started reading the book of Luke. It started with L, so he began reading the book of Luke. And he got to chapter 4, where it said that Jesus came to bind up the brokenhearted and to set the captives free. And he felt, wow, I'm brokenhearted. I've gone through this wartime, basically a refugee status. He was living at that point with 16 people in a house. And he wanted to pursue Jesus, and he ultimately became a Messianic Jew. He married my mother, who wasn't Jewish, and I grew up going to church. I didn't like church. I felt it was I just didn't like it. I just didn't like being there. I wanted to be out doing my own thing. And I was gifted, and I think there's something about gifted people. It usually takes them longer for God to get their attention. I had a poor relationship with my father growing up. And one of the things that I have discovered is that your relationship with God, your concept of God, how you think about God, especially God the Father, has a lot to do with your parenting, how you think about your earthly father. What is your relationship with your dad? Could also have to do with your relationship with your mother. Typically, whichever one was worse, that's the one you assign to God. And so many of us, I would even say most of us, from my experience, we have to unwind some of our parenting in order to really appreciate who God is. Most of us would say, oh, I know who God is. And when things are going well, perhaps when you're sitting in a church service, if I say, what do you think of God? What comes to mind? There may be very positive images. There may be something really positive there. But in a crisis, when you think of God, what comes to mind? What is your default? Where does your mind go when things are not going well? In my family, my father was very critical, fairly angry person. He had suffered a lot in his childhood. So when things are going badly for me in my life, typically I will default to, oh, God must be mad. He must be angry with me. And what I want to do for us this week is to try to unwind some of that, to try to get some new pathways laid down in our brain so that we begin to think of God as a comforter when we're in a crisis. Because when you're in a crisis, the reason you typically go to the refrigerator or to the internet or someplace to stimulate yourself to get some brain dopamine is because you're looking for comfort. And for most of us men, we have been taught it's actually not okay to want comfort. It's not okay to want it. It's not okay to ask for it. We have to grow up, have a stiff upper lip, and be tough. But deep inside, there's a little boy or a little girl who desperately needs comfort. And if you are unable to receive comfort from the Comforter, Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in our affliction, if you cannot receive comfort there, you will receive it somewhere else. And therein is one of the foundations of all the addictions that we have in this country, and we all have them. Some are more socially acceptable than others. It can be a substance, it can be a person, it can be work. Most physicians I know are addicted to their work, and I have been in the past. My medical school training was challenging. Jesus was not really wanted in my medical school. God was not popular, Jesus even less popular. Because when you're in medical school, typically you are young, you're beautiful or handsome, healthy. Most of the people are wealthy. My family was not. But basically, you are taught to believe that you can write your ticket, that whatever you want, you're going to be able to get once you finish medical school. So it is not an atmosphere that is rife with people wanting to follow God, wanting to move toward any kind of spirituality, because the spirituality you're trained with is, I shouldn't say spirituality, it's more of a faith. Because whether your hospital is faith-based or not, there is a lot of faith that people have going to a hospital. It may be in an actual faith or religion. You may have a faith in God, but most of the people have a lot of faith in the technology of the hospital and the medicines that they're going to give you. And a lot of that faith is very, very useful for your healing. But every hospital is a faith-based institution. Faith is required for you to heal. When I was in medical school, I really didn't want Jesus to be the Messiah. That's the way I had been raised. That's the way I had been trained. I went to Sunday school as a child in a Baptist church. As soon as I could leave, I stopped going. But I had learned some things there, and the things that I learned were that Jesus was very nice. Our brain does sort of a shift on us. Much depends on what you want to believe. Faith is much less about logic than about what you want to believe. Basically, what we know about the brain is that you choose what you want to believe, and your brain will make it true for you. Illustration, when those men flew the planes into the Twin Towers, they had very strong faith going to believe that there was a reward for them in the afterlife for doing something like that. That is a powerful faith. These were not insane individuals. These are people with a very strong faith. So just because you have a faith in something doesn't make it true. But you choose what you want to believe, and like those men, your brain will make it true. My experience with the medical system, wanting to fit in. I finished my training, and I wanted to make a name for myself. I wanted to be the best neurosurgeon in the country, neurosurgeon to the stars. I found a job in San Diego. And through a couple of God encounters, I'll call them, God got my attention. The first thing that happened, I was doing a surgery on a woman who had a very large aneurysm. She had a giant aneurysm in the center of her brain. An aneurysm is essentially a weakness in the wall of the blood vessel. It's what happens if you leave your garden hose out in the sun too long. The sun heats it up, it thins out the wall, it begins to expand, and then if it gets thin enough, actually it can rupture. So this woman had one of these in the center of her brain. I did a very high-tech surgery. Very few people could do this surgery. And I sutured a vessel from her scalp, not just to the surface of the brain, but I opened up a window and went down to the brain stem vessels, the very center of her brain. I sutured that little vessel. In fact, you can find it if you feel right in front of your ear. You feel very carefully. You'll feel a little pulse. Put your finger there. You can feel a pulse. That's called the superficial temporal artery. Opened up a window in the skull, looked underneath one of the lobes of the brain, sutured that in a 6-inch hole using a microscope with thread that you can barely see with the human eye. It was a fantastic technical feat. I was so excited I was going to be able to show this surgery at my next meeting. And just a little while later, a few days later, this woman died of a blood clot. It was totally unexpected, and it caught me by surprise. And it really hurt. It was one of the first times in my career that I had been face to face with failure. Technically, that operation was an amazing success. It took me 11 hours to suture that vessel. And she woke up, she was doing fine afterwards, and then I learned that I can do the surgery, but ultimately I can't heal someone. Whenever God is trying to get your attention, He often has a couple things that will come across your path. And this really set me back. It was a hard lesson for me. It was just hard for my identity as a surgeon because I had invested so much time in this case. But I was also dating a woman at the time, and I was not treating her very well. Well, I should just back up a bit. What I knew about relationships, I learned from James Bond. I needed a high-tech, dangerous job, and I had one of those. And I learned that if you can treat women, the more poorly you treat them, the more that they love you. And I couldn't get that to work for me. I tried and tried. It was just not working. And would you know that this woman had the nerve to start dating another doctor who I pointed out to her was not nearly as talented as I was. And I thought that's all that mattered. So with those two painful events sort of very close together, I started feeling off balance. I started feeling, I'd even say, a little bit angry. Well, when surgeons get angry, you'd think they might get introspective, but we don't. We actually just blame other people. The nurse, the anesthesiologist. It's someone else's fault. It's always someone else's fault. It's never our fault. You know, when someone does that, you might even know someone in your family who does that. When someone does that, it means they can't actually handle any of the blame themselves. They are that small. A healthy ego says, I can take criticism, I can learn. If I've done something wrong, let me know and I can apologize to you for it. That's a healthy self-image. An unhealthy self-image is this arrogant, egotistical, it's never my fault self-image that we see very commonly in the medical system, certainly with surgeons and definitely with neurosurgeons. Well, I needed someone to blame for my life that was not working so well, and so I decided I needed to blame my father. It was really his fault. He hadn't really told me much about women, or we just watched James Bond together. It wasn't, there was no education there on how to treat people. He didn't treat my mother particularly well. Well, I wrote him some letters to try to express my displeasure, and he never wrote back. I think many of our parents don't have the emotional range. They also can't handle any criticism because their self-image is also very small. I remember him not writing back only made me more angry. And so I called my mother one night to complain, and I said, really how disappointed I was in my dad. He never encouraged me, just criticized. And she said to me something I will never forget. She said, David, you need to forgive your father because you've hurt people and you need to be forgiven. Well, it's not why I called her. I was looking for some sympathy, and she was telling me the truth. Although I had a hard time receiving this as truth because, well, wait a minute, he's supposed to apologize to me. What is this, me forgiving him? He's supposed to. I'm the one who's messed up here. I'm the one whose life is not working. He said that if I had a good job and I was the best, I would be happy, and it's obviously not true. But that second part, you've hurt people, and you need to be forgiven. Well, now that made some sense to me because that's what happens, isn't it? Someone will offend us, and then we, well justified, will pass it along to someone else. And we don't even see it. It's like King David with his sin with Bathsheba. Nathan comes to him and he tells him a story, and David's very harsh with the man. That man deserves to die. And Nathan says, you are the man. See, when we have this injustice toward us, it makes us blind to what we are doing to others. We don't even see it. So I hung up the phone that night, and I said, okay, God, I forgive my dad. I'm letting him go. He's no longer responsible for my happiness or lack of happiness. You are responsible, but I need to be reparented. I need to see you as a true father. Because my relationship with my dad had been twisting my concept of God the Father. And I wanted to unwind that, and that started the process. Now, the process, I wish I could say, was just a one-time deal. I just forgave my dad that night, hung up the phone, it was over. No. With a situation or a relationship that's had multiple wounds or very deep wounds, it takes a long time. I would say many years. And every 6 months or so, I've had to forgive him again for something else that I discover now in my marriage that I need to adjust. Oh, I got that from my dad. That wasn't correct. I forgive him. God, would you teach me the right way to treat a woman? How we think about God has a lot to do with how we think about our earthly father, our earthly mother. And I just want to pause right there. And I want you to look at your own life and your own parenting, your own experience, your experience in your family of origin. Were there some wounds or were there some patterns from your parents that you can see that you have translated to God? That in a crisis you feel abandoned, you are fearful, you feel very quick rejection, there's something wrong with you? And most of us on a good day know that that's not how God sees you. You're forgiven. You're in Christ. You're beautiful. All those things that he says go out the window as soon as you have a crisis because you default to something that's been taught to you in your childhood. And your brain has laid down some patterns that basically default. It is your default response now as soon as something bad or difficult or uncomfortable happens. I was going to give you a minute to process that, maybe talk to God about it right now. I have a lot of people who come to me and will say things like, my kids don't respect me, my kids are disrespectful, they don't come to see me, they're always out somewhere else. And I want to ask you something. You are a model for them. How do you treat your parents? How do you speak about them? I can tell you, my father had a very poor relationship with his father and mother. My mother the same. So I learned that your parents are something you sort of jettison from. You remove yourself from and you get as far away from them as you can. What are you teaching your kids about how to treat you? See, we think we can tell them, but they're watching us. They're watching us. And almost without fail, they are going to treat you very similarly to the way you are treating your parents. So after I hung up the phone that night, I started calling my dad. I wanted to develop more of a relationship with him. Now, he only wanted to talk about how I was doing basically, or the computer or the car. Very little emotional connection with my father. But for the first time in my life, I was calling him not for me, I was calling for him. Because somehow in my family of origin, we were taught to be very, very selfish. It's all about you. Well, it's not. So for me to be able to bless him, talk about the weather if that's what he wanted to talk about, but I was going to call once a week or once every 2 weeks to check in on him. And our relationship improved dramatically. We were able to talk, and it was just a few years later that he died in a car accident. And I was very thankful that I was able to have that time with him. You see, my father, I see him as a very amazing man. He was like King David, very courageous. He came to Christ out of a Jewish family. So he went against the grain, and it cost him. That's why it's rare when someone comes to faith from another faith, because their social circle and their family, they're going to have a lot of resistance. So your brain automatically is looking for reasons not to believe this. So when you're out talking with someone about faith, the first thing that I look for is, are they open? Is God drawing them? Are they willing to discuss this? Or are they just going to be looking for any reason they can not to believe this because the social pressure is too much? Well, my father very courageously went against the grain. And like King David, he was a courageous man. Perhaps like King David, he wasn't a particularly good family man or a particularly good father. That's for us to judge as we read the scriptures or as we look at our parents. But how does God see King David? Man after his own heart. He's not pulling up his flaws. He's not doing what we do when we are critical of someone and we want to make sure that we have the upper hand, that they're below us, either in stature or spiritually. They don't have it figured out like we do. No, it is only the accuser is the one in Scripture who is accusing people. God is, in the case of Job, saying, this is a righteous man, not looking at any of his flaws. Job wasn't sinless by any means, and none of us are. But God was pointing out his good points. And my father had many good points, most of which I could not see while I was angry with him and bitter toward him. Some of us actually have bitterness toward our parents, and some of us have bitterness towards someone else. Either way, as far as our neurological health, our brain health, bitterness, unforgiveness, anger, even anxiety, depression, some of those things can come from a history of unforgiveness. There's someone in your life, in your past, in your church, in your family that has hurt you, that you are unable to forgive. That's going to be very hard on your physical health. That's going to be very hard on your mental health. Well, how do we get past that? How do we get over that? Well, forgiveness is a huge step of faith. First of all, we have to believe that God is just and that he is going to be able to take care of justice in that situation, and that he's going to be able to make it up to you, whatever it was that you lost, that he has the resources. We think the resources are coming from that person, that if they don't give them to me, I'm not going to get them. Time and time again in the scripture, we learn that God has the resources, and it may not come from the source that you would like it to come from. Is it okay with you if God brings what you want? Maybe it's comfort, maybe it's resources as far as money, a job, someone's laid you off, someone's rejected you, and you want that person either to suffer or to give you what you lost. Is it okay with you if God handles the justice and if he gives you what you want in another way? Most of us haven't even prayed in that direction. God, I realize I'm angry with this person because this is what I lost, but you're welcome to give that to me any way you'd like. I'm letting this go. I'm freeing my hands now, and now my hands are open to receive from you. But you can bring that with another person. I lost this relationship. I'd really like a relationship. Would you send another one my way? I realize this one may be lost. I'm going to let it go. You can bring it back if you like, but I'm open to another one. The money that I lost, that they took from me, Maybe something with the inheritance. I hear a lot of those stories. Father, you're responsible for my resources. You are responsible for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and for Jesus' resources, and for every Bible character's resources, and you're responsible for mine. I'm going to trust you with that. You know, sometimes when we lose a job or we lose a relationship, people come to me and they're very, very upset about it, and they're very angry with the company, they're very angry with their boss, they're very angry with the circumstances. You know, often there's no other way that God can get you to move into another pasture than to close the door for you. And I want to talk a little bit about using our imagination using it in a positive way. Most of us use our imagination, but we use it negatively. That's what worry is. Worry is using your imagination very well, going to the future, imagining what might happen, and your body, your physiology, is treating that as if it's real. It's actually happening. You've gone to the future, imagined what might happen, usually the worst case scenario, brought it back to the present, and your physiology, your heart rate, your blood pressure, is treating that imagined event as if it's real. But I want to start using it in a positive way. Our parents, do we have grace for them when we criticize them? Do I understand what it was like for my father to, in wartime, have to leave his country to come here? You know, your parents, like mine, cannot give you what they don't have. They can't give you what they don't have. If my father did not receive love from his parents, and I knew my grandparents, and I can promise you he received very little love from them. And scurrying around, imagine, it's tough enough during wartime. Imagine we had a war going on here, but then imagine you're Jewish, and you have to leave. And you have to leave all of your stuff and go to another country and start over. What that would do to you, even if you have some faith. But if you only have faith in your material goods, that's a tough blow. That's a lot of fear. So my father was raised in an atmosphere of fear, in an atmosphere of criticism, an atmosphere of anger at the government, anger at the Nazis, anger at everyone around him. He had a hard, hard life. That's all he knew. So he couldn't give me what he didn't have. And I want you to just even think about your parents. And if you need to, you can whisper a prayer. They couldn't give me what they didn't have. Father, I forgive them. They couldn't give me what they didn't have. I'm going to let them go. But I certainly would love some comfort. I didn't really get much comfort from my dad or my mom. And I've been looking for it in the wrong places, on the internet or at the refrigerator. I can tell I'm an angry person. I get angry so easily. It just flares up inside of me. It's usually a symptom of someone who has a problem with being offended or with unforgiveness. Can be some other things, but oftentimes that's the first place that I would look, with bitterness, with unforgiveness. And I want to mention to you that in a church setting where people are supposed to treat you well, there's probably very few people in this room who don't have at least one story of someone who didn't treat you well in the church. Somehow, maybe it was a business deal, maybe it was a social situation. You were expecting someone, or your pastor, someone who was supposed to watch out for you, and they either didn't, or they snubbed you, or they were arrogant, or maybe they just didn't have a personality, a warm and fuzzy personality that you were expecting them to have. And so you left and you're angry about it. You're still angry about it. What I would love to do today, just to clear the closets, clear some of the old skeletons out of the closets, so we can start new this week. Because God wants to help you with that. He recognizes that all this baggage that you're carrying is heavy, and it weighs you down, and it triggers your anger and your criticism. That critical spirit comes up very, very easily. I'm talking about myself. But I know in a crowd like this, I'm not alone. That many of us have been through difficult situations in our family of origin, and then we came to a church or a congregation of faith, community of faith, and we experienced it again. Someone was supposed to take care of me, and they didn't. They were supposed to look out for me, but they actually took advantage of me. Or they just dismissed me. They treated me like I was disposable. And we react. If that is you, something in your heart sort of twists whenever you think of this person or their name comes up, or you hear they've been promoted, you sort of, something twists inside of you. You don't want that to be true. That's not fair. I'm going to submit to you that forgiveness would be a huge blessing to you. It's going to take a lot to forgive, I'm going to tell you, because forgiveness really costs a lot. Somehow we think, we hear sermons on it perhaps, or we know we're supposed to forgive, and we just try to push it in the back of our mind and just get some distance. No, forgiveness actually, it grates on you. But you are never more like God than when you're forgiving. You get to feel a bit what it feels like for God to forgive people who reject him, people who spit on him, people who crucified him. He said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Oh, it appeared they knew exactly what they were doing. They nailed him to a cross while they said, come down from the cross. They just kept mocking him. It appeared that they knew exactly what they were doing, and it appeared that they knew exactly what they were doing to you. But in the mind of Christ, in the mind of God, people actually don't. They're looking out for themselves. They're just looking out for their own interests, and you're just a lower priority. It may not be as personal as you think. In Jesus' case, it looked very, very personal. But Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. I wonder if you could just stop now and say a prayer to him. Father, I realize that the people who hurt me, maybe it was my father, maybe it's at work, maybe it's in the family, they didn't know what they were doing. Their anger, their addiction, their low self-esteem. I don't know why they did that to you, but I do know that there's few things more healing than forgiveness, because it takes humility. And you have to believe that you are a child of God. You have to come into your identity to forgive. You can't forgive sort of flapping in the wind. You can't forgive from an insecure place. You need to be secure. I am a child of God. I am in Christ. I have the mind of Christ. From this secure position, I can forgive because Daddy is going to take care of it. He has all the resources. He can bring me new friends, a new job, a better community, a new relationship, the money I need, the resources I need. He can bring that to me. It takes faith to forgive because you're looking to him to give you what you lost. And you may want to include that in your prayer. Father, this is what I lost. Would you give it to me? Let's just get personal with God right now, and let's just spend a minute talking to him about what you lost, and then together we'll go through a forgiveness exercise. There's power here today to get some of this stuff moved into the past and live out the freedom that Jesus promises us. So I'm going to give you a minute now of silence just to forgive, just to talk with God about these things. All right, for many of us, these are some deep wounds. And what I want to do is a declaration of forgiveness. It often starts the process if we can just declare it. God spoke the world into existence. His words have power, and you are made in the image of God, and your words have power. When you speak words out into the atmosphere, they have power to bless or to curse. And when we speak these words, you are moving in a spiritual direction that is very, very positive. So let's say these things together. I choose to forgive with all of my heart for the things that they did and the things that they didn't do that hurt me. Specifically, I forgive them for, and I'm going to give you just 20 seconds. I want you to, whatever it was, especially fear, rejection, abandonment, betrayal, money, any of those things, I want you to go through just specifically and say, I forgive them for this. Line by line, I want you to start erasing those things, because you are holding that as a ledger until you're paid, and your mental health is never going to be fully free and coming to the destiny that God has promised you until you can set these things in the past. So I specifically forgive them for. Now the more specific, the better. If you say, I forgive them for everything, that has one level of forgiveness. If you say, I forgive them for this money they took from me, back in 2003, that has even more power. So I'm going to give you 20 seconds now just to specifically forgive. All right, let's continue. I forgive them for all these things. I forgive them for all these things. I set them free. And I set myself free from this prison of bitterness and anger and resentment. And knowing all that this has cost me, I cancel their debt to me. They owe me nothing. They don't owe me an apology. They owe me absolutely nothing. I set them free. And I set myself free. Father, would you give me what they owe me? Would you give me what I need? Holy Spirit, come and heal my heart and tell me your truth about this situation. Now I want you to listen. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to listen for the voice of God. He comes very close to those who have the humility and the determination to forgive. This is powerful stuff. Listen. If you hear a verse, you may see a picture. You may think of someone else you need to forgive. Something may come to mind, something you need to be forgiven for. You need to confess. When we start to forgive, we are really tapping into a spiritual, powerful arena. One that your enemy wants to keep you away from, wants to keep you well justified in anger. And if you're having trouble forgiving, I think probably most of us are. It's if you can feel the gears grinding, it's just not right. Because what they did was really harmful, was really painful. And as we forgive, we're not saying it wasn't. What they did to Jesus was really painful, really harmful, and appeared that they knew exactly what they were doing. A couple of things that you can use if this is too tough. You can say, Jesus, you're the one that told me to forgive. I need your help. Because many of us who have been wounded, especially wounded very deeply, we never really need God's help. We asked for it, but we pretty much got it taken care of on our own. We are self-sufficient. That's what we have learned because of the wounds of childhood, to be self-sufficient, to do it yourself. And so for you to say, I can't do this. I am unable to forgive this. It's too big for me, Daddy. Would you help me? Too big for, oh, he would love to help you with that. Another thing you can do is say, Father, how do you see this person that hurt me? How do you see my ex? How do you see my parents? How do you see my wayward child? Show me how you see them. Do you have love for them? I want to see them through your eyes. Because as I look at them through my eyes, it just makes me angry. I only see their flaws. I only see their faults. One of the things that resentment will do is it will bring up the person's flaws, and many relationships are destroyed because all you see are the person's flaws. Maybe when you got to know them, you saw their good points. But because of what they've done, now you only pull up their flaws, and you're reminded over and over again about their flaws. And as we forgive, you can say, Father, would you start showing me their good points? I want to see them. And I needed to look for those good points in my father and in many of the people that have hurt me as well. So let's just pause for a moment. Let's just ask God, Father, that person that I am trying to forgive, would you show me how you see them? Show me their positive points. What good character qualities do they have? I want to see through your eyes. I want the mind of Christ. Many of us have not treated our parents like Jesus treated his parents. You know, when my father asked me to mow the lawn, I looked for every reason not to do it. And when I did it, I didn't do a very good job at it. Always looking to try to get out of something. Always treating my mother and father as if they really didn't know that much, weren't really clued in. You know, your mindset, how you treat your earthly parents can often transfer to God. And we may not experience the intimacy and the power of our relationship with God until we can go back and say, you know, Mom, you know what, Dad? I'm sorry. I did not treat you with respect while I was in the house. I didn't mow the lawn. I didn't do the things that you wanted me to do with joy and with responsibility. I always whined. I always complained. You see, I used my father's anger as an excuse not to do the stuff that he asked me to do. Because he had his flaw, therefore I was on my own, do whatever I wanted. And that's a trap you get pulled into. It's a lie. And to be able to go back, and I even encourage you tonight to go back and write a letter to mom and to dad. If there's any issues in your life, whether you mail it, that's going to be up to you. But I encourage you to get those things down before God to say, you know what, I did not treat my parents with respect in these ways. I didn't honor them in these ways. We know the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you. The only commandment that has a promise. I had to go back. My father was already deceased when I was doing this process, but I did go to my mother and say, Mom, I did not treat you with the respect you deserved. I didn't obey you willfully, gladly, joyfully. It was always with resistance, and I'm sorry. Because I want the relationship with my Father now, my Heavenly Father. Both of my parents are deceased. I want my relationship with my Heavenly Father. I don't want anything between us. I want to treat my Father as if He's always good. He always knows the best thing, not always second guessing, oh, I'm not sure this is the right way. When He speaks, I want to be able to hear that voice and respond to it as an obedient son who trusts the Father that this is the right way. Well, that's not my history of my childhood. I'm going to need to redo the pathways in my mind for that. And one of the ways that we can start is to clear the closets of some of the things from our childhood. So I recommend that tonight, writing a letter to mom or to dad. So I'm going to finish up now, and then we'll take, if there are any questions, I'll take so we'll do some Q&A here. It's 3:30. Those who need to leave are welcome to go. Those of you who want to stay for some Q&A, if we can do some of that. Yes?
I have a question. I'm requesting that you tell the story in your book about the Marine who came to you because of neurological problems and how you helped him to forgive.
So a man named Ron came into the office. He was a former Marine, but he was working for the Border Patrol in San Diego. 40-year-old man. Huge, big muscles, crew cut. But this man had pain in his back, pain in his neck, arthritis in his knees, and he had a malformation of the brain, an arterial venous malformation. So I talked with him about the arterial venous malformation, but whenever I notice someone who has, I would say, more problems than they should have, I'm thinking, is there a medical reason, or is it a social reason, a spiritual reason, an emotional reason? What's going on here that essentially this person's immune system is not functioning well? And so after I talked with Ron about the procedure, I said, Ron, I want you to heal from your surgery, and so I just want to ask you a question. And this was the first time that I had done this. I had been reading books on forgiveness. I said, Ron, is there anyone that you need to forgive? Again, this massive man has sort of looked at me and started getting this angry look on his face. And I'm on my little black rolling doctor's stool, and I'm rolling back away from him, trying to get against the wall. And finally, Ron dropped his head. He said, yeah, my mother. I said, your mother? Yeah, I was young and my father took off, but I lived with my mom and she lived with this that guy, and they would drink. And finally, when I was 12 years old, I'd had enough of it. And but these guys were, this man was hitting her, and I got between her and this boyfriend, and he hit me and he pushed me down the stairs. I got up from the bottom of the stairs, and I said, "Come on, Mom, let's get out of here." And she said, "No, I'm not leaving." He said, "I have hated her since that day." Wow. I said, "Ron, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Because it's killing you." See, bitterness is like poison that we drink, but we hope someone else dies. Your hatred of your mother is not affecting her. It's killing you. All this stuff, your bitterness is just your body's churning with it. It's destroying your joints. I said, "I want you to do something courageous." I said, "I'll help you, but I want you to do something courageous. I want you to forgive her. I want you to let this go. It's been 30 years. It's done enough harm for you." And I never want to push people to forgive on a one-on-one situation. And so I just waited, and he said, "Okay, let's do it." And so essentially I led him through a prayer like I just did with you. Choose to forgive. And he just was weeping and weeping and weeping. It was beautiful. And then at the end I said, "Well, Ron, God says if we forgive, he wants to forgive us. Is there anything you want to be forgiven for?" And so he listed a number of things that he wanted to be forgiven for. And he had gone to church as a child, and so I said, "Well, Jesus will forgive you for that, if you'd like him to." And it was just a beautiful reunion of a man who, like myself, had gone to church early in life, but then had stopped. And he just sort of was a new man. His whole countenance changed. He had this beautiful smile, this radiance about him. He sort of floated out of the office. It was a wonderful experience. And his surgery went well, but 6 months later, he still had the joy in his life. And I was very, very pleased to see that. So this is something that I use in my practice. It's something very, very powerful. Many people, when they have serious wounds, actually need someone to help them forgive. You can do it on your own, but for some of these things, because they're so big, and oftentimes it's like a knot. Because when someone offends you, sins against you, the most natural thing is that you're going to do it to someone else, or that's going to trigger you to do something either to someone else or maybe to yourself. An addiction will start or something will happen in response to this injury. Well, now it's not just as a matter of a simple, "I forgive them." Now my own sin is involved. Now I've got kind of a knot. And then I may even get angry with God for allowing the whole thing to happen. So now I've got God involved. I'm angry with him. I've got my own sin, which I'm sort of regretting, but then I've got this person who I'm angry with because they've sinned against me. And you've got this tangled ball. And basically in my office, what I try to do is tease some of these apart. Okay, we need to confess this one. Because confession, and we may talk about that in another session, another powerful thing. Forgiveness, powerful. Confession, equally, maybe more powerful. Because humility is required to confess. Confess this, then we forgive this. And then we look at this honestly through God's eyes. What really happened here? Oh, wounded people wound people. Hurting people hurt people. People who hurt you, hurting people. My parents, hurting people. Your parents, probably hurting people, probably wounded people. We all are. So we start to give grace to that generation or give grace to those people, and guess what? we also give grace to ourselves. And I believe the reason I can stand up here and talk about my faults and my flaws and who I am and not have to stand on my high horse with this big facade of neurosurgery in front of me is because humility and honesty and authenticity is the path to joy. To truly be able to be who I am, whether or not you like me. That's freedom. I don't know that my parents had that. They had to perform. They had to make sure, especially if you're Jewish and people hate you, you want people to like you, and you're going to start pretending to do whatever you have to do to make it safe for you to live. Well, I didn't grow up that way, but I certainly, that spirit is with me, and I know people-pleasing. We'll talk more about that in another session. So is there another question? I will mention also some of the resources I have online on my website. I've got some breathing exercises, and we will talk about some of that in another session. How I believe that our physiology has a lot to do with the way we think and the way we interact with God. And that we're so busy and we're always on our cell phones that our breathing pattern is erratic, and it makes it more difficult to pray. And so I've got some scriptural little songs like I played for you here that have breathing cues along with them. So I've got some things to help you breathe in synchrony. And it's explained on the website. I may explain that a little more later.
I am 72 and I still haven't figured out how to slow down. How do you pace yourself?
How do I slow down? Well, the first thing I do, and I recommend to everyone, is Sabbath. Now, this is an interesting, in this audience, to be talking about Sabbath, but when I say I write songs on the Sabbath, I mean, I shut my phone off, no email. I treat it as a very special day. I often, will take an extra nap. I really want to use that day to connect with God, to change my pace of living. It's difficult. It's difficult every week. But I will just challenge you, if the Sabbath is not truly a Sabbath for you, if it's full of social engagements, if it's full of networking or whatever you're trying to do, busyness at church. Many pastors have a big problem on Sabbath. How do you rest when you're actually working that day? So there's some different things, but if I can, and I believe most, if not all of my ministry has come out of shutting down for 24 hours. Now that's 1/7 of the week. That's an enormous tax on your week, or so your brain thinks. I'm wasting all of this time, but we're made for it. And that people who are too busy, who are too anxious, are unable to slow down, the first thing I will say is take a good look at the Sabbath. What are you doing and what are you not doing? It is, first of all, I just have to be honest with everyone, it's just not easy. Because of these devices we have, we're so connected. And we get dopamine in our brain every time we hear the ding go off that there's a text from someone. It's like a casino. You're carrying a casino in your pocket. Is that the one I want? Oh, maybe there's money in that. We're so stimulated. To shut that thing off on the Sabbath is difficult. And I mean, I'll walk by sometimes, I'll twitch a bit. I just want to check. That only shows you how addicted we are, and I'm just speaking for myself, but there's a tremendous freedom and tremendous, as you start to control your mind, if you can get yourself away from electronics, at least for 24 hours, and then you can talk about other things. Yeah, play, the research, or neurological research now is showing that play has a lot to do with your mental health, your ability to play. And since we were children, many of us have never played. We just work. And we go to videos for play. We don't actually play. So play or fun is very, very important. In fact, what they realize with all of these serial killers and sociopaths is that in their childhood, they were not allowed to play. So your mental health is very dependent on your ability to play. And as an adult, it's sometimes frowned on. You're being frivolous. But play, for me, also can be reading a book. How do you spend some free time that seems luxurious? As we read the fourth commandment, the commandment about Sabbath in the Bible, it is the longest of all of the commandments, and it talks about you not being a slave. If you're producing 7 days a week, you're a slave. You're a slave.
Yeah.
And so you say, well, no, it's about sonship. It's about being a child of God. Children don't have to work for their parents. And so seeing yourself as a child of God is another step, and test it out. Do some planning. How would you spend that free time to play? Be a little frivolous. And some people think it's going for a walk, getting out in nature. All those things I recommend.
Okay, good. I saw a hand. Yes, right here.
If you suffered abuse as a child and your parents are both dead now, how do you cope with the fact that you can't make it right with them now? You can't forgive them. And I know that there's things that I wish I could ask forgiveness for too.
Right.
But this has been hanging over me for a lifetime. So
Good
I'd
question.
like to
Thank
have
you for
your
asking that. Yes, if your parents are deceased, mine are deceased. It's what I first of all recommend is just getting it out in a letter. Write them a letter, and that is something you can give to God to figure out how to get that to them and ultimately read it to them eventually. But those are the kinds of things you want to get it out of you. And as you start to release that stuff, you can start to heal. So that's very important. Good question. How, writing letters to the deceased and remembering the deceased in a positive way. I talk about my father as a very real man with some. I received some very real wounds and lack in my childhood, and yet I remember the good things about him. I would probably not be